So I've been asked by some followers to expound in detail on the political power vortex theory model that I developed. I developed this model by modifying and combining some existing accepted theoretical models and capturing an untapped variable of consolidation of power in a longitudinal manner, so across time. So to begin with the 2x2 political compass, which is often used for individuals to describe where they self-report along an x-axis of economic and social, somewhat otherwise nebulous concept of left and right, and a y-axis for the state's role in enforcing their model between libertarian or individual liberty, which is to say not much, and authoritarian, in which the state rigidly enforces their model. But this framework is also useful in determining where a current government falls along the same axes. But in this case, I needed to modify the shape of this framework because government doesn't enjoy the same freedom of movement in the lower echelons as it would, say, at the very top of the model. And so it's reasonable to restructure the framework so that it converges at the bottom to zero, or what we would call theoretical anarchy. And so this sets up two dimensions of the model. Likewise, with the horseshoe theory, we see liberalism at the apex in its original context, not the context as hijacked by 20th century progressives who had burned their brand and now wear the face of liberalism like Hannibal Lecter. This is liberalism in the American founding sense and what is meant internationally, liberty for individuals. And so the midpoints of socialism and conservatism, while somewhat nebulous, given that to truly conserve the American founding values is to be, quote, liberal in the liberty sense. And socialism has demonstrated historically that the goal was communism. In fact, all communist regimes called themselves socialist and never really achieved the theoretical nirvana of true communism, hence the line from the left that we've never really had real communism. Though I think we've run the experiment in the 20th century enough times to not repeat it. So note that in the horseshoe, the extremes bend back toward one another and are considered capable of arcing across the gap as authoritarian regimes and extremists tend to merge into similar tactics, doctrines, and methodologies. And while the theoretical extremes could be mapped across other variables to include systems like theocracy, I've opted to rely on a reasonable existing framework and keep the traditional left and right in the forms of communism and fascism. The latter historically falls out of communism in that fascism has to date been the reaction, or I would say the overreaction, in its opposition to communism. This is also why neo-Marxists always call any opposition fascist, A, because it's an effective narrative in dissuading the uninitiated from opposing critical theory-based methodologies and tactics, and B, because through their own literature they actually desire fascism to rise up in opposition so that thesis and antithesis can clash, iterating the Hegelian dialectic sense, the synthesis of both fascism and communism, which they theorize will usher in a utopian system in which the Übermensch or new man can arise. This is an idea that aligns with the Luciferian notions in Refined Story, in which the adversarial spirit opposed to objective reality and objective truth attempts to make a new reality in his own image. The neo-Marxists have claimed objective reality and truth never existed through ingredients provided by postmodernist philosophers Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. And so while horseshoe theory imagines each of the dots representing the different systems across a single plane, when the model is merged with the modified political compass in which government power converges to zero, we see that these dots aren't on the same plane at all, with liberalism down further into the vortex, represented here by the American founding, and the earlier Articles of Confederation that, while more liberal, after events like Shays' Rebellion, the Constitution institutes additional state power, but just enough to provide stability. Theoretical extremes are mapped to the corners of the interrupted vortex. The green zone represents the system that fosters individual liberty, the red zone, authoritarianism. The yellow mid-zone is the stepping stone to authoritarianism in the form of entrenched bureaucracy. This direction has had drivers from both parties, from Woodrow Wilson and FDR to both Bush administrations and establishment Republicans like Gerald Ford, Mitch McConnell, etc. So while American conservatism in theory conserves liberty in any given period, establishment Republicans of entrenched bureaucracy seek to conserve the status quo of their day. In this feedback loop, the choice is between running toward the authoritarian cliff or taking a casual stroll toward the same ends. So while horseshoe theory can demonstrate in real time the swings of political power in U.S. politics, it doesn't capture the cumulative compounding effects across time. So what appears to be swinging back and forth between opposing parties and ideologies in a sequence of wins and losses, when mapped in the vortex, demonstrates the dialectic effect of continual stacking of centralized federal authority. So the horseshoe isn't really capturing liberalism per se in the arriving back to the center. It is merely capturing the centrism relative to any given time period. And so the data that validates this model: federal statutes have accumulated without reversal, expanding regulatory control. The vast federal code enables selective enforcement, the essential weaponizing of justice, suppression of dissent, two-tier justice, like we saw this play out over the last 4 years. So it's neither hypothetical nor theoretical anymore. This is the Stalinist principle in action of show me the man and I will show you the crime. And it's an inevitability without pruning the federal code. Elon has spoken about this at length, and I think he's absolutely right, that this trajectory without reversal ends up in complete and total authoritarianism of 5 felonies a day for everybody. Government spending and debt continue their exponential climb along a similar curve, binding future generations to obligations they never consented to. Bureaucratic inertia grows with it. The federal workforce expansion has ensured a system that entrenches itself deeper, insulating power from electoral consequences. At the same time, inverse curves tell another story. The average family size in the U.S. has declined, shifting obligations from households to the state. Purchasing power has eroded as inflation and monetary devaluation effectively tax the individual while leaving government spending unchecked. And so these aren't isolated trends. They're corollaries of a broader force that's captured in this model. one that centralizes authority at the expense of individual autonomy. And so this framework is just that. It's a single framework that, like its predecessors, has utility in its central focus, but at the cost of other utility elsewhere. There are no end-all be-all frameworks, and a framework that looks at, say, the aforementioned other forms of authoritarianism like theocracy could also be beneficial, while demonstrating the same costs and trade-offs as this and all other frameworks. But this provides a proper lens for understanding the trajectory of political power, not just in theory, but in practice. And so it illustrates how centralized authority expands across time, often regardless of which party holds power in any given moment. And so the question now is, what do we do with this understanding? And so if this framework helps to clarify the patterns you've already observed, share it with those who need to see it. The only way to break this cycle is to recognize it and make sure others do too. If this framework has been useful to you, share it. Tag your Republican representatives and spread that word. The more people who see it, the harder it becomes to ignore. Because we need our own prairie fire without succumbing to the use of critical theory as a response, which is precisely what leads to the rise of fascism and the Hegelian iteration our adversaries want to occur. So I hope this has been enough detail in explaining this model. So thanks for following, liking, and sharing.